The problem is most of us don't realize that that is the most accurate, you can see I've used this a little bit, the most accurate word to describe what happened. It was a miracle. No country in the history of the world up to that point had ever written a constitution with a tripartite government and checks and balances. Had not happened. However, to really understand the miracle and what was involved and what was going on, we have to get into some history. Because most of us maybe remember the history we heard back in high school or in primary, but unless you've studied it recently, you haven't gotten much. All right, the true beginning is earlier, but we have to start at 1763. 1763 was the end of what we call the French and Indian War. The rest of the world calls it the 7 Years' War. Why is that important? Because at that point, Great Britain was the major power in the world. They had defeated France and thrown them out of the continental United States. They had beaten the Indian tribes. They were kings of the world. Their problem was that they had a 137 million pound debt that was costing them 5 million pounds a year. Now, I tried translating that into modern money, but it got to be way too high. This is a humongously large debt that they were carrying. And they justifiably said, listen, most of the fighting that we did benefited the colonies over in North America. Let them pay. Not a bad idea, really, because it did benefit us. The problem was they couldn't get out of their own stubborn, ingrained British ways. What do I mean? They could have very simply had the Prime Minister, with reference to the King, write letters to the 13 colonies saying, you know, yes, we know you can only tax yourselves, but here's the reality of life. We would like to give you a chance to prove that you are loyal citizens of your liege lord and sovereign king, and collect the tax money and help us reduce the debt that benefited you tremendously. The sun's coming up in the west before the British could do that. They could not remove all of their many people and sinecures who were playing with paper and doing things, and they couldn't change the whole mindset of the British royalty and the British nobility.
Is that another word for DC?
Just about. So they passed the Stamp Act. All right? Their first big mistake was the Stamp Act of 1765. That started the beginning of revolutionary thought publicly. Virginia sent the Virginia Resolves that basically said that the colonies may only be taxed by their elected representatives. And there was a Stamp Act Congress on October 19th that said, in the name of all of the colonies and your sovereign and your loyal citizens, they presented a declaration of rights and grievances and a petition to Parliament and the King to repeal the Act. 1766, the Stamp Act was repealed, which was sort of a chink in the armor. But just to show that they weren't really folding their tent and going away, they passed the Declaratory Act. The Declaratory Act stated that, sorry guys, we can do whatever we want. You're our subjects. We're the King and Parliament. We can tax you. We can do whatever we want. And from there it goes downhill. All right, the 1767, there were the Townshend Acts. These were external taxes instead of internal taxes on various articles that the colonies bought and needed because manufacturing hadn't quite caught up with the population yet. One of the things that this had in it was writs of assistance were basically wide open search warrant. This bothered the people tremendously. Then in 1768, the legislature of Massachusetts sent out the Massachusetts Circular Letter, and it was written by Samuel Adams. Samuel Adams was one of the serious major moving forces in the American Revolution. He could never be involved in government, although he was involved in the Massachusetts House, but in terms of national government he couldn't do that. But to foment and to keep going in the face of adversity, he was absolutely brilliant. He was a highly religious man, and he was absolutely brilliant. In 1772, Sam Adams organized the committees of correspondence so that the 13 colonies could keep in touch with each other. The Patriots could keep in touch with each other. A side note, there was an Englishman named John Wilkes. John Wilkes was one of those characters that the British throw up every once in a while. He was an absolute rake, and he was an absolute Republican in terms of personal liberty and liberty of the people. He, on his own in Britain, started committees of correspondence, and he was in personal correspondence with Samuel Adams. So Samuel Adams got the idea from John Wilkes. And now, because of the Massachusetts Circular Letter, you had foreign troops staying in Boston. They were British. And that led to the Boston Massacre. Why? Because the people didn't like having troops there, where they had to house them and feed them. In 1773, there was the Tea Act. Shortly after that, there was the Boston Tea Party, where 342 chests of tea were thrown overboard. And again, one of the small points that people don't understand is the absolute fervor involved with that Tea Party. The British had, the East India Company had more tea than it knew what to do with. So the Tea Act was, we will ship it to the colonies, and that's the only tea they can buy. And to make it attractive, they lowered the tax on it. They made it really cheap because they wanted to get it off of everybody's hands. The American patriots wouldn't buy it. They would buy the Dutch smuggled tea, which was more expensive, in lieu of buying the British tea and supporting an act of parliament that was not done by their representatives. And then they had the Tea Party. Now in 1774, Great Britain, in its usual heavy-handed way, in a vain attempt to reassess its authority, passed the Intolerable or Coercive Acts, okay? March 31st, 1, the Boston Port Act. It blockaded the port of Boston until the people of Boston repaid Britain the cost of the tea and all of the duties that were owed. This started the colonial cooperation and unification because it was so blatant. The second act, the Administration of Justice Act, which was, well, we can move the trial wherever we want, and your witnesses have to come with you and pay for their own way, and they were going to have basically Star Chamber trials up in Nova Scotia. That didn't go over too well either. All right. The Massachusetts Government Act, which threw out the Massachusetts legislature and put in the King's people. And finally, the Second Quartering Act, which allowed the governor to house soldiers anywhere he wanted in the colony. These were really the glue that held together the beginnings of the war. Now, these intolerable acts caused many of the colonies to make resolves against them and send them to the king. How many of you have heard of the Orangetown Resolves? Right. They were adopted on July 4th, 1774, exactly 2 years before the Declaration of Independence. The resolutions were part of a widespread movement of town and county protests of the Intolerable Acts. The resolutions were adopted at the home and inn of Joost Maybe, a Dutch colonial house in Tappan, which is still an operating restaurant. Later on during the war, it became the prison for Major Andre, who, along with Benedict Arnold, was going to hand West Point over to the British. And they have 7 points that were in the Orangetown Resolves. Okay? I just thought I'd throw that in there for a little local history that most of us probably didn't have a clue about. Even so, at the end of this, they made it clear that they wanted to remain subjects of the king. They were not, by and large, interested in independence. Then we had the Battle of Lexington and Concord. That was it. By the way, I used to say Concord until I visited some friends in Boston, and they said, no, it's Concord. So that's the official correct pronunciation. After that battle, or during that battle, when they knew it was coming, Sam Adams and John Hancock had to leave because they were under a death sentence for actually wanting to declare independence from the king and crown. Okay? Then we have Fort Ticonderoga captured. Now remember something. The town of Boston, which was a major port, a major trading area, was closed, blockaded, and was loaded with British troops. Somehow, a batch of Vermont Green Mountain boys and Benedict Arnold captured Fort Ticonderoga. And they brought, General Knox did something amazing. He brought back all of the cannon, and they put them up in the heights around Boston. British woke up one morning and said, "We're leaving." It was no longer a defensible position, and they had to leave. On May 10th of 1775, pardon me. All right, May 10th, 1775 was the Second Continental Congress. The First Continental Congress was in 1774. Now think about this for just a minute. Continental? Continental? Imagine the thinking these men must have had to be able to claim it as a Continental Congress. They were a little strip of land on the seashore, basically. Oh, they had some western lands, which nobody lived in, essentially. But Continental, and then a Congress. That name Congress gives us a hint as to what they were thinking. Up until then, a Congress was a meeting of heads of state in Europe. And words were not used as casually and loosely as we use them today. Okay? Then in June of 1775, you had the Battle of Bunker Hill, which technically the British lost, but it was a very Pyrrhic victory for them. Then we had July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence, signed by the 13 sovereign states. What does that mean? It meant that each colony now considered itself a state on a par with Great Britain, with France, with any other national entity. And this attitude lasted a long time. General Robert E. Lee, when he was in the United States Army, when he was asked to serve for the Union, he said, "Sorry, I'm going back to my home state of Virginia," because that's where he felt was home. That was a leftover from the Revolution. The Treaty of Trent, when the British signed the peace with colonies, was with the 13 separate independent states. This is crucial to remember. Now, while this was going on, the Second Continental Congress was trying to run a war. These guys hadn't been elected. They'd maybe been chosen by somebody locally, but they'd come together to try and do something. The other thing it's hard to imagine, and it really is how massively radical these events were. You've got to understand, everybody who was who was watching from the sidelines, a spectator, was expecting Britain to win. They were the major military power in the world. And we weren't a bunch of upstarts. The other thing is, declaring independence from your sovereign king and creating 13 states, you cannot, unless you start reading in depth in this, you cannot begin to conceive of how massively radical, earth-shattering that was. People can just, what? They did what? Yes, they declared independence from the king, and then they beat him. Now, one of the more interesting realities is most of the history most of us have received had been, shall I say, pablumized, okay? E pluribus unum. Well, it was more like e unum pluribus, because you had this Continental Congress, which eventually had the Acts of Confederation, Articles of Confederation, which left them able to do even less. But the colonies, the states, were not pulling their weight in terms of payments. All right? The letters of George Washington pleading for money and supplies are almost pathetic to read. All right? They were in desperate straits. But also, the reality is, most of the fighting was going on up north. Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware, and South Carolina didn't worry a whole heck of a lot about it. until finally we took Boston, we took a few other places, and then we chased the British out of every place except New York, and they went around, came up, and went into the South, and then all of a sudden Virginia and North Carolina, etc., said, hey, wait a minute, we got a part of this war too, can you help us? In other words, there was real regional differences in terms of supporting the Revolutionary War. How far did that go? The state of Maryland asked the French for help at one point. And the French said, maybe you better sign the Articles of Confederation first before we help you. They hadn't signed yet. So that pressure from France caused Maryland to sign. Eventually, all 13 signed. The Articles were ratified in 1781. October 19th, the British surrendered at Yorktown. All right? End of war. The Treaty of Paris, not trans, was 1783 with 13 independent states. Now, I sent my core group a Happy Evacuation Day notice. Anybody know what I was referring to? November 25th, 1783 was the day the last British soldier and the last royalist left the United States. And it was celebrated for a long time as Evacuation Day. It was moved out of the picture because its date was November 25th. President Lincoln, in the middle of a civil war, didn't feel comfortable with having an evacuation day and having beaten the British and all this unity stuff. He didn't feel comfortable with that given what was going on. So he made an official proclamation, which had not existed, that Thanksgiving would be the last Thursday in November, which conflicted time-wise with Evacuation Day, and consequently Evacuation Day got forgotten because Thanksgiving actually had a much longer heritage of celebration in the nation. But it wasn't official, it wasn't made federal until 1863. Prior to the Constitution. I'm taking the time to do this because, again, I want you to appreciate just exactly what was accomplished at Philadelphia. It's crucial to know. You had factions that you cannot imagine. You had speculators speculating on the state's certificates, sort of like money, but not quite. The Congress was kiting checks in Europe, as a matter of fact. There was no money. You had the commercial and manufacturing and shipping interests in the North. The middle states were sort of caught between agriculture and commerce. The southern states, which were the slaveholding states, and let's not forget that, were also primarily agricultural, and they needed shipping, but they weren't all that interested in all this commercial stuff. You know, they just wanted to sell their product and get their stuff and go home. And the problem with it also was that the Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, really had no power. They had no power to tax. They had a power to set a requisition, a request to the various states for what they should send in. Georgia never sent in a dime, as it turns out. Right? They couldn't do much, and this is why, as early as 1785, certain people in Virginia and around the Potomac were thinking of setting up something else, changing things. That gives you sort of a background setting. Don't forget this happened, the Constitutional Convention was May 14th to September 17th, 1787. Vocabulary and word games. Discover did not mean to find something new. It meant to disclose or to reveal. Nervous meant strong and vigorous. Absolutely the opposite of what we think of now. That's what it meant. Awful, that which inspires awe or respect, not something horrid. Natural, the present meaning plus discovered by reason. To regulate meant to make regular. And democracy, and if you read through things They didn't like democracy because it was based on the word demos, which in Latin means mob. They weren't very keen on that. What were they keen on? They were keen on individual liberty. They were keen on the fact that every man is private, has his private property, is the king of his castle, and can keep the fruits of his labor. The concept of a large, powerful government was an abomination to them. They hated it. They had been under tyranny. They knew what it was like. And this is why there was such a big conflict between 13 states and one nation. When they were molding together the Constitution, the one thing they were trying to make absolutely certain of, that it would not become a large oppressive government. Again, as I mentioned, the North versus the South, and the South with slavery. I'll mention that some more when we get into the actual document. The other idea is any man, it was the concept of welfare meant people who were doing okay. All right? Welfare didn't mean what we mean now. The word was twisted to make it sound constitutional when they passed all the garbage in the 30s. How well are you faring is what it meant. Okay? Concepts like this are important. The other thing is any guy, reasonably healthy man in his 20s or 30s, worked a little while, could buy an axe and some supplies, go out, clear a plot of land, build himself a house, and he had something. Why? Because there was, tons of land available, acres upon tens of thousands of acres. And you didn't have to go begging permission from the parliament or this person or this big shot or that big shot. You got your stuff and you went and you built. Maybe it wasn't very palatial, but it was yours. And no man could take it from you. That's important. The other thing is, why a written constitution? This was also a revolutionary concept, literally very revolutionary. The reason they wanted a written constitution was because they realized that the unwritten British Constitution had been mutilated beyond all known form. And that was in 1787. They wanted a written constitution so that it would not be as amenable to destruction. So you couldn't say, well, it says this, but maybe it meant that. No. Here's what it says, guys. Read the document. The fact that it has happened what has happened is some of what we will get into in deeper depth next week. We'll start now. All right, another bit of words is the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. You've got the Federalist Papers, and you've got the Anti-Federalist Collection by Herbert Storing. Problem is, that was a word game. The Federalists wanted you to believe that they were for a federal government, which meant a few distinct powers were given to the national government. Everything else stayed with the states. The people who were labeled by them as anti-federalists called themselves Republicans with a small r, because they wanted to make sure that it stayed a republic with a weak central government. And this is what the whole argument was about. They both wanted liberty and private property and all of the rights that we have under the Constitution, but the Republicans wanted to make sure that it couldn't get taken out of hand. And they looked at some of the details and said, no, that's not going to fly. But they were called the Anti-Federalists. The other problem was the Federalists said, here's our program. The Anti-Federalists could only stand and say no. They didn't have an alternative program to offer by and large. And if they did, it didn't get out enough. Right? Another bit of mythology that I would hate to destroy, but it needs it, is the Federalist Papers, written by John Jay, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton. Madison and Hamilton were both known to favor a very strong national government. John Jay was not part of the Constitutional Convention. But these were written not so much as an explication of the United States Constitution, although it does a pretty good job of that. They were written as a propaganda piece for a particular political program. All right, that's what was going on there. There are tons of anti-federalist writings, okay? They've never gotten the praise of the Federalist. But the reality is the Federalist does give you a pretty good idea of what the Constitution is supposed to be, but it is really a propaganda document to get it ratified. A couple of tidbits, another bit of word game, just to remind you. The Civil War wasn't a civil war. What technically is a civil war? It is two competing groups or powers fighting to see who will take over the government of one country. That wasn't what the issue was. The South wanted nothing to do with taking over Washington. They wanted to be left alone to stay closer to what they felt were the mores of the United States Constitution. Calling it a civil war makes it look dirtier and uglier than it was. It was actually the war for Southern independence, and the South lost. A couple of little tidbits that are not mentioned very often. Secession was a condition of 4 states ratifying conventions. They ratified the Constitution with the condition that they could secede. Virginia, Maryland, Rhode Island, and New York. Okay? So when the people in the North said, no, secession is totally unconstitutional, malarkey. Malarkey. New York almost seceded before ratification because they were so upset with what was going on. Another tidbit. Oh, by the way, does anybody know where the New York Ratifying Convention was held? Poughkeepsie, New York, of all places. It has some claim to fame. In 1788, July 4th, the anti-constitutional bloc was so upset with what was happening in Albany, they publicly burned a copy of the United States Constitution. Think about that. At the same time, a group of people who were pro-Constitution in New York City wanted to have a procession. They had everything planned, and then they canceled it. Because I find this hard to believe, and I just read it. The date for the procession conflicted with a major Jewish holiday. Now, 1788, there was no big Jewish voting bloc, folks, but they wanted to show the concept of not just people unity, but religious unity. So they rescheduled it, and of course there was a very bearded rabbi walking in the front of that procession. 1788. That's not the astounding part of that concept is just mind-boggling. It's not like today where, you better go to Borough Park or to Williamsburg if you want any votes because there's a big voting bloc. No, that wasn't happening. There was no big voting bloc then. 7 states had either official religions or denominations at the time of the ratification of the Constitution. How many of you knew that one? All right? Connecticut was Congregationalist. New Hampshire, New Jersey, and South Carolina were Protestant. Maryland and Delaware were Christian, and Massachusetts was Congregationalist. Okay? The big deal is that this was made, it's a very, very short, easy to understand document, was made to keep government small and keep people free. Now, after that brief introduction, we'll actually get to the Constitution. Starts with the preamble. A preamble has no legal power. It is what they call hortatory. It's just, nice fluff. But what did it say? It said, "We the people of the United States." That right there caused problems. Because later on, Daniel Webster, who was no dummy, would argue that the states were created by the Constitution. There were the Webster-Haynes debates on that topic, where other people were saying, no, the states made the Constitution. Well, the reality is that's accurate and true. So why did it say "we the people" if it was actually the states?